Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. First of all, we would like to introduce Stephen Friedman as the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher and artist, a scientist, a great speaker of ours. We would like to give big thanks to the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please make sure to give your comments, send your feedback, and ask your questions that we'll definitely address in the end of the next talk. And today, Stephen Friedman will address the questions from the previous talk. So, Stephen, thank you very much, and thank you, the audience.
Thank you so much, Aaliyah, as always, for the introduction and for your participation in making these talks possible. We also obviously want to thank the American Consulate in Almaty, Elmira, Dana, the entire team that facilitates this platform to provide philosophical perspectives on a broad range of issues. Often these talks are key to international days. Other times they might be key to a historical event that I think has particular significance and ultimately philosophical significance. This week's talk is related to some historical events and religious observances that capture the interest of a lot of the world's population. April 8th is the date celebrated as the birth of Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, the historical Buddha. Today in Kazakhstan, April 15th, is Good Friday, celebrated in the Western Christian tradition as the date this year of the crucifixion and death of Jesus Christ, one of the most important events in the entire Christian worldview, eschatology, the Christian tradition. On Sunday is Easter Sunday, the date that commemorates the resurrection of Christ. And those two events, Good Friday, the crucifixion and death of Jesus, and Easter Sunday, the resurrection, are as central to Christian observance and Christian faith as any dates in the Christian calendar. They are central in their meaning and their observance to what has made Christianity the most embraced of all the world's great religions. I think Christianity has more followers than Islam or Buddhism, obviously much more than Judaism. Those are four of the most active faiths in the contemporary world. But in particular, the Christian, Islamic, and Buddhist traditions engage the sympathies of lots of human beings and have over the centuries. Well, the specific philosophical direction I'm going to be taking is the philosophy of avatars. An avatar is a Hindu term. It's used, obviously, in contemporary internet circles, right, as a representation of an icon that can represent an individual. But the original Hindu meaning, which is what I'm embracing for this talk, is descent in Sanskrit, the traditional language in which religious writings in Hindu culture were written. Well, the descent specifically of a deity, of a God, into this world. Christ, Jesus Christ, in the Christian tradition, represents such an avatar. Krishna is probably the most celebrated of the Hindu avatars. Christianity embraces that one specific avatar. Hinduism, as we'll see, recognizes many. Islam, in general, does not embrace the concept at all. For Islam, there's an emphatic separation between God, Allah, and any other form of life, any other created form. But within Christianity and within Hinduism, avatars provide intermediaries between God as a transcendent entity and human life, and the challenges, urgencies, despairs, all of what energizes the efforts of humanity to try to respond to the tragic sense of things. Well, let me give you from the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu Song of God, as it would be translated, a representation of what an avatar is and does. And it is, let me find it here quickly. It is this: whenever righteousness wanes and unrighteousness increases, I send myself forth for the protection of the good and for the destruction of evil, and for the establishment of righteousness. I come into being age after age. Hinduism recognizes cosmic cycles, endless cycles of destruction of the world and its regeneration, rebirth. Within each cosmic cycle, there are recognized as being numbers of avatars, numbers of times when the supreme deity will appear in human form to convey a message of hope, resolution, in an attempt to bolster, the spirits of humanity overwhelmed with challenge. So it's a central part of the Hindu tradition. It's a part of the tradition of human traditions broadly that arises from a sense of the profound unsatisfactoriness, dissatisfaction of our circumstances. We talked last week when we were talking about the philosophy of health that people in many cultures traditionally looked to the past as an ideal time of human life. And the present represented a corruption of what was originally something perfect, something pristine, something without suffering. We today look technologically forward to a time when science and technology will address the insufficiencies of life as we experience it and be able to conquer disease, extend life indefinitely, restore, whatever might have been lost, in primal times, a primal Eden to life on Earth through technological means. Well, the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition sees life as having begun in Eden, in a perfect environment, a perfect world without suffering, without disease, without mortality, without death. There was then a fall from grace, right? An act of disobedience in the dominant mythology, expressing why we are in this situation. An act of disobedience by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that was forbidden to them. Well, that led to the expulsion from the Garden of Eden and the subsequent experience of life in all of its mortal demands and limitations, all of its manifold modes of suffering, of dissatisfaction, of insufficiency. It's a sense of present life that's captured by the philosopher Emerson, the 19th century American philosopher who wrote, and whom I've quoted before, "Great nations, great spirits are not boasters or buffoons, but perceivers of the terror of life. That's what we're talking about. The terror of life in all of its different forms. Anxieties about the future, anxieties about mortality, anxieties about whatever it is that leads to fundamental and profound dissatisfactions with human experience. Let's see here. The Buddhist tradition recognizes that same depth of dissatisfaction, that same problematic aspect to our world. But Buddhism doesn't depict the encounter with the unsatisfactoriness of life as having resulted fundamentally from a loss of a primal state of perfection at the beginning of time, which we also find, for example, in the Greco-Roman tradition, where at the beginning of time there was a golden age, and everything since is corrupt and unsatisfactory by comparison. Buddhism poses the issue and confronts the issue much more immediately, existentially, and non-mythologically. Its fundamental myth, its historical legend, is that of the historical Siddhartha Gautama, a human being who had the good fortune of having been born into wealth, into a powerful family, into a leading family of northern India. His father insulated him from all of the challenges and difficulties of life. And supposedly, for the first 29 years of his life, Siddhartha lived within palace walls, shielded from everything problematic that the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, that the Greco-Roman tradition recognized as having been brought upon humanity when it lost its earliest and most perfect situation. So Siddhartha Gautama supposedly had had no experience with disease, old age, and death. That is the great triad, the three main aspects of the human condition that for Siddhartha Gautama ended up capturing what was so profoundly unsatisfactory about human life and what so immediately and desperately needed a response, a powerful response, a definitive response. I deal with the logic of Buddhism, and I talked about it before. I deal with it actually in Phalaris's Bull. I give it there an account in prose, of the circumstances that led Siddhartha to his investigations of a response to mortality and something of the logic of that response. I also deal with it in poetic fashion in the books of Joshua. And I think what I'll recite on this occasion, because there is poetry in the concept of the avatar, of someone coming to our aid. It's a powerfully consoling and comforting notion in the way music can console and comfort. Well, so let me recite from the books of Joshua the account of Siddhartha's experience of mortality, discovery of it, and the response he engenders. Siddhartha sought to end disease, old age, and death, here and now. But how? Not in a laboratory, through technology, certainly not 550 BC, but if not, then what? The reality extends to the limits of conceptuality and no further. But can we subject a concept to first-degree murder? That was the Buddha's attempt under the Bodhi tree, where he let fly the concepts of mortality in the land of the sacred cow. But how? For Aristotle, the syllogism was the model. The Buddha came before, but logic is a door. 1. The real lasts, unlike the ephemeral shadow a dream casts. 2. Nothing lasts. What Siddhartha sees in the breeze of life's immemorial pasts. 3. Nothing is real. This is the seal, the Buddhist reveal, that peels away the skin of disease, old age, and death, the mask and breath of mortality, to steal freedom from the wheel. But does its logic anneal, regardless of how it makes us feel? Well, I go on to explore that issue, and we'll do that in just a minute. Siddhartha was elaborating ultimately a religious response. But notice the form of the religious response. It's not based upon an intervention by a deity. It's not based upon really a revelation coming from outside human experience. It's based upon a logical, really, set of propositions, reasonings that lead to this fundamental conclusion that disease, old age, and death do not have the power and the status that we normally, typically imagine and suffer. The best way that I find to explain what Siddhartha was thinking, what he was doing, was to attempt to strip the world of concepts. He can't go into a laboratory and disease, old age, and death technologically. We can't go into a laboratory and end that triad technologically. And it's certainly a long time off if it's ever forthcoming. But he nevertheless felt he had succeeded. Buddhism thrived. We know of Buddhism because of Siddhartha's conviction that he had succeeded. So the question must be asked, what was he thinking, right? And what he was thinking was that he had found a way to eliminate the concepts of disease, old age, and death. And that's what that logic, that I referred to. The real lasts. Dreams are not real because they vanish upon our awakening. But reality persists. But then under the Bodhi tree, he has this intuition of universal flux, universal change where nothing lasts, not even God, not even the laws of science, not anything. And that leads to the conclusion that nothing is real, which strips the world, strips the concepts of the world of their force, of their power to control our lives and weigh upon us in fear and anxiety and endless concern. The mature expression of this Buddhist accomplishment, Siddhartha's insight and his logic, is given in a work that I've referred to before also, the Heart Suture. It's a concentrated work that appears later in the Buddhist tradition. It's part of a tradition known as Mahayana Buddhism, but it is a work that is memorized by Buddhist monks to this day, recited daily, if not multiple times a day. I often tell people when they make comments that my philosophical work is difficult, I said, no. No, if you want to see something that's difficult to understand, look at the Heart Suture. Compared to the Heart Suture, my work is relatively crystal clear. Of course, that's also what Wittgenstein thought about his work, that it was clear. It had no, there was no difficulty in understanding, except for the fact that it only was genuinely understandable if you would come to the ideas yourself. In the case of my work, it's partly understanding the basic ideas, but then also seeing how they apply to everything else. But nevertheless, my propositions like the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past, or the world is different in different directions. And one can draw from that all types of profound consequences about our circumstance. Or we suffer because we imagine we can see the world from the outside. These are much easier to come to terms with than the Buddhist formulation. But let me just give you a sense. And as I read this, keep in mind that this follows from the Buddhist conviction that it was possible to eliminate concepts, end concepts, including disease, old age, and death. That's what this summarizes. So let me just read this to give you a flavor of one of the great works. Oh, here I have images. I always forget to show images. I selected some images to accompany this. First, this is an image of the Bhagavad Gita. That is Krishna in basically the center. The figure that is seated is Arjuna. He is a warrior that Krishna is coming to advise, to deliver his message of salvation, his message as an avatar. I mentioned Emerson. Great nations, great spirits are not boasters or buffoons, but perceivers of the terror of life. And obviously, and there's a panel, a representation of the Bhagavad Gita. And here is a representation, a sculpture of the Buddha, the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. The most important aspect of representations of the Buddha is how calm they are. There's a story. I was going to tell this, but let me tell it. It just comes to mind. There's a television show in the United States where people bring in artifacts from earlier times, other cultures, to have them appraised and possibly to sell them. And there are authorities that do the appraising, do the evaluation of the artifacts. Well, one day, one person brings in a figurine that he thinks is a Buddhist figurine. He thinks, in fact, it's not just of the Buddhist tradition, but of the Buddha himself. And the proprietor says, no, it's not of the Buddha because the hands in the figurine are directed forward. And that is a gesture of respect. But the Buddha is the enlightened one. The Buddha has solved the problem of human life definitively once and for all for advocates and embracers of the tradition. The Buddha does not need to show respect. The Buddha shows no respect. You show respect to the Buddha. So, okay. Here is why the Buddha within the tradition, is seen as meriting that level of respect, of regard, of embrace. This is the Heart Suture. Oh, and let me just show you. Here is what the Heart Suture looks like in Sanskrit. You see, that's the whole Heart Suture. It's very short. Not as short as my aphorisms, but short, okay? Throughout history, people have been aiming for concentration, concentrated formulations. They are powerful and they are memorable, and they are things that one can carry with one for times of need, right? That's how I see my aphorisms in general. You can always, at a moment of challenge, at a moment of death, run such an aphorism through your mind, and it can comfort and console. You don't have time at moments of crisis to read a novel or a disquisition, volumes of philosophy. Okay, so here is what that says. I'm not going to read actually the whole thing, even though it is short. I'll read most of it because it is short. And when the Heart Suture refers to Sariputra, that is one of Siddhartha Gautama's disciples, one of his close followers and consorts, someone who accompanied him, on his teachings. O Sariputra, form does not differ from the void, and the void does not differ from form. Form is void, and void is form. The same is true for feelings, perceptions, volitions, and consciousness. Sariputra, the characteristic of the voidness of all dharmas are non-arising, non-ceasing, non-defiled, non-pure, non-increasing, non-decreasing. Therefore, in the void, there are no forms, no feelings, perceptions, volitions, or consciousness, no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, or mind, no form, sound, smell, taste, touch, or mind object, no realm of the eye until we come to no realm of consciousness, no ignorance and also no ending of ignorance until we come to no old age and death and no ending of old age and death. Also, there is no truth of suffering, of the cause of suffering, of the cessation of suffering, nor of the path. There is no wisdom, and there is no attainment whatsoever. Because there is nothing to be attained, the bodhisattva relying on prajnaparamita, that's the perfection of perfect wisdom. That's what this is an embodiment of, has no obstruction in his mind. Because there is no obstruction, he has no fear, and he passes far beyond confused imagination and reaches ultimate nirvana. Again, that comes down to the elimination of concepts, all concepts. Not an easy thing to accomplish. Again, the logic through which Buddhism accomplishes that can be distilled to what I gave, the real lasts, nothing lasts, therefore nothing is real. The problem with that formulation, though, why Buddhism is characterizable as a religion and not philosophy in the sense in which we understand philosophy. I understand philosophy. I've been representing philosophy in these talks as the limit of rigor. Is the second of those propositions that nothing lasts is a belief. You can't know that, right? We can say that the laws of physics don't last, that a God, if there is such a thing, even a God does not last. We can't know that. So when we exceed the bounds of what we can know, rigorously know, legitimately claim we have left philosophy for religion, even for science, right? Because I've emphasized that science bases a lot of its conclusions, a lot of its formulations on controlled experiments, but controlled experiments cannot be conducted within this world, which is different in different directions, okay? So, this you may not have heard often or ever, but really, science and religion have more in common than either does with philosophy. Because philosophy is strictly about what rises to the level of an incontestable rigor, what is unchallengeable in principle by the nature of the proposition. The past cannot guarantee the future decides the past. That's a gloss on how our concepts work. That if tomorrow we awaken to a totally different reality, this was dream. The nature of future experience has the capacity to alter, reverse anything we've imagined about the past. And remember, that was my response when a prominent rabbi asked me about the philosophical relationship to extreme human suffering. The worst the human condition offers, the Holocaust. And I answered him in just those words. The future decides if it ever occurred and has power to reverse it, not to deny the Holocaust, but to affirm the power, the philosophic power of future experience. And I've told this story before because I think it's an important story. The rabbi, instead of throwing me out of the office, asking, that I be escorted, out of the Jewish tradition completely, said astonishingly to me, because I'd never been aware of this aspect of the Jewish tradition. He said, that's what the Messiah is supposed to say. Well, my response to that in general is, if that's what the Messiah is supposed to say, then the Messiah is philosophically astute, because that's what, any body that embraces the reality of our circumstance has to embrace. Okay. So Buddhism, in the formulation that I provided, which I think is the clearest formulation I've ever seen in Buddhism, it's something that I came to through my studies, and I was fortunate enough to study Buddhism at Harvard with a very prominent Buddhist scholar, and elsewhere. I even took some courses on Buddhism in the philosophy department there. But the notion of Buddhism aiming for a deconceptualization, a stripping of the world of concepts, is, again, something that Buddhism doesn't achieve rigorously, but that philosophy does. And we go back to this always because it's so fundamental to orient to the philosophical perspective. Those propositions summarize the nature of heuristic, epistemic space, and the connection between the two of them. Heuristic space is our conceptual space, the space in which we recognize objects, we can name things, we can describe things. It's a linguistic space, a technological space, our scientific space, in which we carry out controlled experiments where the experimental and the control groups are in effectively similar circumstances or situations, not rigorously so. Rigorous circumstance is what epistemic space characterizes. Heuristic space operates according to the fundamental logic of identity. Something could be equal to itself. That identity proposition is not formulatable, does not exist within the epistemic. Any two things are rigorously distinct. And so the upshot is, heuristic space is one in which we are bringing things together, encircling objects based on family resemblances, as Wittgenstein would put it, similarities for some purpose or other. If things are chairs, if they have a certain appearance and they can support us in a certain way. Epistemic space recognizes no such family resemblances at the limit of rigor. So an epistemic space is an aconceptual space, is one in which no concepts arise at all, no things group or cluster together. That obviously means that we don't describe epistemic space from within. When I am describing it variously, I'm using words, I'm using concepts. And so I'm describing the epistemic from the perspective of the heuristic. But nevertheless, we can get a characterization and a sense of its characteristics and structure. And its structure is that of a deconceptualized space in which rigor achieves what Buddhism aspired to in terms of its formulation, its logic, but a logic that did not rise to the level of rigor. Buddhism was formulated 2,500 years ago. We've made intellectual progress since then. Our understanding of the nature of rigor has advanced, has clarified, has distilled through contributions not just of philosophers, but mathematicians, of mathematical logicians. So the intellectual history of the last 2,500 years has not been beside the point. It has helped us clarify and put on a firm foundation rigorously what Buddhism aspired to. So lots of the final formulations of Buddhism can be embraced philosophically, but with the understanding that their ultimate justification is through the nature of epistemic rigorous space, rigorous representation, which doesn't allow concepts to arise in the first instance. Okay. I mentioned from the outset that we were talking about avatars, right? Interestingly, the Buddhist tradition, from its origination, from its historical beginnings, roots, did not see Siddhartha Gautama as an avatar, not as God in human form. It saw Siddhartha Gautama, in fact, what distinguished Siddhartha among religious traditions that would later emerge was the fact that he was a human being seeking a rational response to the human condition in all of its diverse problems and challenges. Buddhism arose in India. Buddhism is one of the great world religions. Buddhism has become central to the culture, certainly the religious culture of much of Asia, Southeast Asia, China, Japan. It's even had a profound influence in the United States. In the 20th century, Buddhism became of increasing interest in the United States to American scholars and people seeking alternative forms of religious understanding and alternative solutions to the world that were not based upon a revelation, a communication of God to humanity. Buddhism existed in India for about 1,000 years. It originated around 500 BC, and then it disappeared. Left India after about 1,000 years. And there's been lots of speculation why. In fact, it's something that Andre Malraux in Anti-Memoirs, a book I have referred to many times in the past, addresses in conversations that he has with prominent Hindu figures, Hindu thinkers. Again, in terms of a philosophical coming to terms with that issue, we can't go back in time, we can't do a controlled experiment, we can't change some aspect of Hindu circumstance, Buddhist circumstance, and see what might have avoided the disappearance of that tradition, what might have led to its having endured. We can't do that. So we can't say for sure. But one compelling heuristic response to that question is, at some point, and within the Mahayana tradition, this later Buddhist tradition that the Heart Suture represents, the Buddha became seen as a deity himself. Once that happened, the Buddha took the form of an avatar. Once the Buddha took the form of an avatar, he was no longer seen as quintessentially human, quintessentially historical. He was seen now as comparable to other central religious figures and impulses within the Hindu tradition. He became, as it were, one god among many gods. And as much as anything, that may have led to Buddhism's disappearance from the culture that had originally allowed Buddhism to develop. So early on, we don't see Siddhartha as an avatar. We see him as a human being confronting human challenges. But given the nature of his success in that endeavor, the profundity of his results, he is, throughout much of the later Buddhist tradition, the Mahayana tradition, seen as a deity, a god, an avatar. Okay. The most celebrated of all avatars is Jesus Christ. And as I mentioned, today in Kazakhstan, the 15th of April this year, it changes yearly, is Good Friday, the day that represents the resurrection, the crucifixion, the death of Jesus. I wanted to give you some images of that. Let me make sure I've shown you everything that I wanted to show you so far as well. Yes, I have. Oh, I'm keeping up to the images, this week, which is extremely unusual. Okay, here is one of the famous representations of the crucifixion. It is a drawing, a very late drawing by Michelangelo. It has a quality, a spiritual quality. Some people attribute it to the fact that it was done late in Michelangelo's life when he was beginning to lose some dexterity. But be that as it may, it's a profound representation, profoundly evocative representation of the crucifixion. A representation of what followed immediately after the crucifixion, after Jesus' death, when he was removed from the cross, is called the Pieta. The most famous, probably, of all Pietas is what's called the Vatican Pieta. It's in the Vatican, in Rome, also by Michelangelo. It was done when he was a young man. I think he was about 21 when he executed this work. It is Mary, the mother of Jesus, of Christ, holding the dead body, the dead Jesus in her arms. It's the only work that Michelangelo ever signed. It's the only work he ever considered quite complete. It's one of the most astonishing works of sculpture in existence, in terms of not just its overall conception, but in terms of its detailed execution. It established Michelangelo as the great monumental sculptor since antiquity. It overwhelmed the reputation of the other leading sculptor at that time, Donatello. At the end of his life, around the time when he did that drawing of the crucifixion, we have another representation of Jesus having just been removed from the cross, again on Good Friday. This is called the Rhonda Nini Pieta. Also an intensely spiritual work in terms of its abstraction. People, will say that, well, its abstract forms are partly due to the fact that Michelangelo, maybe approaching 90 at this point, had lost some of his skill. But again, it's profoundly evocative of the occasion, of the spiritual significance of the death of Jesus. I've emphasized how important the notion of torture is within the world's religious traditions, within the world's philosophic tradition. The patron saint of philosophy, St. Catherine of Alexandria, was tortured to death on the wheel, St. Catherine's wheel, at 19 or so, maybe 18. When Buddhism, which seeks to end human suffering, right? For Buddhists, all life is dukkha, sorrowful. Suffering, the Buddhist enterprise is to end it, to find a way out of it, not to embrace it. When they encountered, originally, Christians wearing a cross, the symbol of the crucifixion, the symbol of Good Friday, they were astonished. They didn't know what to think. They said to themselves, to each other, why do they worship a man being tortured? We want to end pain, not embrace it, not worship it. It's everything we're trying to find the solution to. Well, one can argue, again, one can't do the experiments, one can't know for sure. So whenever we make comments, anybody makes comments, that refer to things that are not rigorously validatable, they're heuristic in some way or other. They stimulate thought, or they stimulate discovery, they might stimulate literature. Well, or journal articles, academic articles, but not at the level of philosophical rigor. When Christianity is the world's most embraced faith at this point. I'm not sure quite the numbers. I think Christianity is, number one. Maybe it has over 2 billion followers. Then it might be Islam, then Buddhism, but I haven't looked those numbers up, and I don't take the numbers that I see too seriously anyway. But roughly, we're talking about maybe a couple of billion, maybe more, maybe 2.5 billion Christians. So the most embraced of all the traditions. And the question often arises, why? And my answer is always, because they don't skirt the most fundamental of all issues, the extremity of human suffering, represented by torture to death. They confront that directly, immediately. Their tradition arises from its recognition and the ultimate response that's generated to it on Easter Sunday, 3 days later, with the resurrection of Christ. Again, it's something that philosophy doesn't skirt either, in the form of St. Catherine of Alexandria. It's something that I have never skirted in my philosophical work. I've mentioned before that when I would sit down to write philosophy, before I reached the point where philosophical aphorisms would just kind of come to me, I would imagine myself in horrific circumstances, buried alive, burned over 90% of my body, adrift in space to an inevitable end. I would imagine myself in these horrific circumstances, being tortured to death in some way or other, and then I would say to myself, okay, now, write philosophy. Because if philosophy can't respond to that extreme set of circumstances, it's not rising to the level of my interest and of human need. Well, one of the great tributes, poetic embodiments of Good Friday is by the American, later British, he was an American expatriate, poet T.S. Eliot, a Nobel Prize winner. He wrote late in his life a deeply philosophical and religious work that I've quoted from before, 4 quartets. It's my favorite of all his works. I was obsessed with it for some period of time, I think late in high school and in college. I carried it around with me, for a long period of time. He has a section that directly addresses Good Friday. And I thought I would read you, not the whole of it, but a little bit of it. He's a difficult poet, but I think this is understandable largely. Let me turn to it. Oh, and here is T.S. Eliot, poet, also literary critic. In the Anglo-American tradition, great poets have also often been great literary critics. I refer a lot to John Berryman. He's in that category. Samuel Johnson, he's in that category. Randall Jarrell, same category. Well, here is a little excerpt from 4 quartets. And I'm going to read a little bit more than I thought. This is about half of this section. The wounded surgeon plies the steel that questions the distempered part. Beneath the bleeding hands we feel the sharp compassion of the healer's art, resolving the enigma of the fever chart. Our only health is the disease, if we obey the dying nurse whose constant care is not to please, but to remind of our and Adam's curse. And that to be restored, our sickness must grow worse. Adam's curse is the loss of paradise, of Eden, and the burden of mortality, disease, old age, and death in Buddhist terms. It is to redress that original loss that Christ, as an avatar of God, enters the world to redeem human suffering, to heal. God in human form redeems human life, sanctifies human life. That is the essence of the Christian vision, achievement, eschatology, understanding. Here's the end of that section of the poem. The dripping blood, he's referring to Christ on the cross. The dripping blood, our only drink. He's referring to communion when Christians, when Catholics re-experience the tragedy and ultimately the miracle of crucifixion and resurrection. The dripping blood, our only drink. The bloody flesh, our only food, in spite of which we like to think that we are sound, substantial flesh and blood. Again, in spite of that, we call this Friday good. That last line gets to the point of the occasion, right? That we are talking about the death, the crucifixion, the torture to death of Jesus Christ. And yet, what do we call the occasion? What do Christians call the occasion? Good Friday. That, again, is the enigma of Christianity as far as Buddhists are concerned. Why good? It's the worst of all occasions, the worst of all experiences. Good because of what follows, because of what it ultimately signifies, the conquest of the worst of the human experience, to heal the human race, the human spirit. Now, that healing is achieved on Easter Sunday, the resurrection, when Christ rises from the dead, when Christ overcomes the horror of the crucifixion, of the torture to death, the horror of the human condition, and affirms the greater power of Christian salvation, of the Christian God to restore that primal condition of bliss, a beatific vision of the world. Well, I have a representation of that to show you. Notice I'm showing things by major Western artists. There are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of representations of the crucifixion that I could show. But for me, if there's a choice of Michelangelo, I will go to Michelangelo. In the case of the resurrection, the rising of Christ from the grave, I will go to Rembrandt. And here is Rembrandt's depiction. Okay. You can see that is now Christ rising from the earth to his seat in heaven on the right hand of God, a seat of glory, representing the triumph of the Christian spirit, the Christian faith, the Christian hope over the tragedy, the terror of human life in all its dimensions, and especially at its worst, or even at its worst. Now, there is a poem about Easter Sunday that has a slightly different view of the occasion. It's written by A.E. Housman, an English poet, late 19th, early 20th century English poet, that I also have quoted and have referred to on many occasions. It was A.E. Housman that made a remark that I used in Phalaris's Bull, when I was talking about the work that I did in some of the cancer work I had done. And I talked about how like several hours thought was involved in applying philosophy to a cancer technological upshot application. And people often say, just hours? And I quote A.E. Housman's remark, 3 minutes thought. 3 minutes thought would suffice to resolve some issue he was discussing with somebody, but thought is difficult, and 3 minutes a very long time. It's A.E. Housman. I find him valuable in lots of contexts, but I find him especially valuable on the occasion of Easter Sunday, the occasion of celebrating the avatar, the intervention of Jesus Christ as a redemptive figure, as a savior, to again restore the primal, heal the primal fault, as it's sometimes described, the loss of Eden. Here's the A.E. Housman poem, and you'll see it's a different take, but an important take that intersects a little bit of the philosophical endeavor. That's why I like to recite it. It's called Easter Hymn. If in that Syrian garden, ages hence, ages slain, you sleep and know not you are dead in vain, nor even in dreams behold how dark and bright ascends in smoke and fire the flames you died to quench and could but fan. Sleep well and see no morning, Son of Man. But if the grave rent and the stone roll by. On the right hand of majesty you sit, and sitting so, remember yet your tears and agony and bloody sweat, your cross and passion and the life you gave. Bow hither out of heaven and see and save. A. Heuristic is writing not as a committed believer of the Christian faith and the Christian promise, but as somebody who still experiences the suffering of the human condition and is beseeching God to return here, now, heal us here, now, end the horror of the condition once and for all, here, now. Not for the end of time, or not just through some act of committed faith, but here, now, definitively, for all of us. It reminds me, actually, that the spirit of Easter hymn, it reminds me of stories I've been told, and I've read, of Wittgenstein, who liked to walk. Thinkers, philosophers, creative people in general, composers, have often liked to walk, because walking seems to promote creative activity, creative thought, ideas. Wittgenstein would take walks at night, often accompanied by a student. And by the account of one of those students, periodically on their walk, Wittgenstein would stop and look up and sigh, as if beseeching the heavens to provide that kind of immediate response, immediate answer to the depth and the challenge of our circumstance that A.E. Heuristic was beseeching. It's that recognition of the nature of the problem, the depth of the problem. Whatever solution one is interested in formulating, that solution is only going to be strong, only going to rise fully to the occasion of our need if it begins with a profound recognition of the problem. That's the power of the historical account of Siddhartha Gautama. He had been isolated from disease, old age, and death. When he encountered their reality at 29, it was encountered overwhelmingly. It's not like he had been acculturated to disease, old age, and death. He hadn't ever experienced it. And the notion that people could live their lives knowing that this was their fate and not devote every ounce of energy and endeavor to finding a solution, if such a solution was at all possible, astonished him. He could not continue to live within the palace. He needed to find an answer because of the depth of the problem that he recognized and the force with which he experienced that problem. You find the same sentiment in the writings of Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, the great Danish philosopher. I've tried to find the passage. I think it's in his concluding unscientific postscript, one of his works, but I haven't been able to relocate it. So I'm paraphrasing, from memory when I read this passage a long time ago. But Kierkegaard talks about how no one should even talk of religious experience, the religious life, unless they find themselves going to bed, not because they're tired, but because they no longer dare stay awake, because of their recognition of the overwhelming weight of the problem of mortality. It's said within the Buddhist tradition that the full depth of human suffering, the full depth of our pain, of our suffering that Buddhism is addressing, that the great religions are addressing, is not understood, not appreciated until we have reached the further shore. In other words, it's only from the perspective of nirvana, only from the perspective of paradise or mystical union with God, when we merge with the avatar, as it were, that we really understand the nature of the terror, the horror of human circumstance. That, again, the great religious spirits have recognized, they have seen and felt the problem with the full depth of their being. And that has motivated the power of their responses. Okay, we're doing okay. Okay. Again, back to the main concept of avatar. The Hindu tradition originated the term and the concept. They were using the concept before Christianity arose. Judaism doesn't really have that concept. I mean, there is the concept of the Messiah within Judaism, but it's not quite clear what the relationship is between Messiah and God. It's not quite clear, at least in my exploration of the tradition, that Messiah is functioning. I mean, it might be functioning as an avatar, but not quite in the way of like Krishna being God in human form, fully God in human form, or Jesus Christ being fully God in human form. Hinduism has a broader sense, really, of the notion of avatar. And it's something that the Bhagavad Gita expresses elsewhere. And I've quoted this before, but I will quote it again. This is Krishna describing his nature to Arjuna, the warrior who he has come to help overcome, again, Arjuna's fears about going into battle, fears of life. Among rivers I am the Ganges, says Krishna, says Vishnu, the supreme deity in human form. Among rivers I am the Ganges. Among purifiers I am the wind. I am time without end, and I am death. I am death that seizes all, and the source of all that shall be born. I am beautiful speech, memory, steadfastness, and forgiveness, and the silence of things secret. Hinduism is a polytheistic tradition. It recognizes many gods, but the real significance of that is it's seeing divinity in many places, in the Ganges, in the greatest of human life, in the greatest of human experience, in the greatest of human enterprise, effort, aspiration. It sees God, it sees divinity in human form. Here's a little story. I'd like to tell personal anecdotes that illustrate my understanding of these traditions, these ideas. They are never meant to be self-serving. I promise you, they're only meant to help you understand something more about these concepts and something about how I came to understand some of these concepts, which might, I think, help people in their efforts to understand what are often difficult concepts. Well, so not self-serving, but to illustrate this concept of divinity being in whatever is beautiful or enlightened, and keep in mind, we all have special qualities, right? We all have strengths. We are all capable of goodness. And so we all manifest aspects of divinity as the Hindu tradition will recognize this. But when there was a time, I mentioned that I had a girlfriend years ago who was an ice skater, a figure skater. That's how I came to appreciate the Russian figure skaters. Kamila Valieva. I had been schooled in figure skating and its appreciation by a girlfriend of mine who was an Olympic aspirant who I'd been with for 8 years. So this girlfriend left figure skating because she had an ambition to enter medicine, the health sciences. And figure skating is enormously demanding in terms of time, in terms of energy, and she wanted to devote herself more now to medicine. So when she left figure skating, she got a job actually to gain experience within the health professions in a laboratory of molecular biology, actually, at UCLA. There was a woman, a postdoc, somebody who had already achieved her PhD and was working in the laboratory, from India. Her name was Vijay. That was her first name. She was a woman, maybe around 40. But had spent, much of her life in India, and then had come to the United States to do research. One day, my girlfriend was talking with Vijay and was mentioning that I was writing philosophy, and so Vijay expressed interest, and I'd written at that point maybe 5 or 6 books of aphorisms, large numbers of aphorisms. I think the largest book contained maybe 900 aphorisms, but there were 5 or 6 of them. Now there are hundreds of such books. At that point there were a few thousand aphorisms altogether. Now there are maybe 20,000, and other forms of writing too. That was early in my philosophical career of writing philosophy. So Vijay expressed interest, and I gave her manuscripts of these 6 little books. And one day, after some time, I went to the lab to meet her and get the books. And she said to me something remarkable that is characteristic of Hindu culture, of this concept of divinity, how divinity manifests itself in a great river, in the wind, in acts of goodness, kindness, strength, courage, resilience. She said to me, if you take these books, because of how we respect philosophic culture, of how we respect philosophy, if you took these aphoristic writings, got on a plane, flew to India, she says to me, when you leave the plane, as you leave the plane, you will find yourself seen as a Hindu god. Again, not because of me in some, but because of the nature of the writings, that she said they so respect and would respond to that type of writing that they see divinity in that writing, as they see divinity in a great river, in acts of goodness or kindness, in beauty, in anything that is recognized at an elevated level. They see an aspect of the avatar that is fully realized in the case of a Krishna, but partially in individuals who are otherwise doing things that exemplify the spirit of divinity. Now, in that regard, I wanted to return quickly to, because I know we have some questions and I want to make sure I leave enough time. I want to return to Kamila Valieva. I gave a talk on her a little over a month ago, I guess, a month and a half ago. And I was focused on basically what happened during the Olympics and her failure to perform and the hostility she was experiencing on the part of the public, on the media, certainly the American media, the media that I was reading. I mentioned that when she went to perform her long skate routine, there were members of different skating confederations that walked up and left the arena in protest because she had been, she had had a positive drug result for a heart medication under questionable circumstances. Remember the Court of Arbitration for Sport had decided that it was appropriate that she be allowed to skate. And the point of that talk I gave was that once that court had made that decision, she should have been allowed to skate. And we then would have had potentially the experience of one of the great moments in Olympic history because of the nature of her talent. Well, after the Olympics, she returned to Russia. With the conflict in Ukraine, Russian athletes have been banned from a lot of international competition. There was an international world skating competition that Russian skaters were banned from. And so Russia organized its own exhibition competition sorts, okay? Which quite honestly was where the interest lay, because certainly Russian female figure skaters are the greatest in the world by an order of magnitude. I think it's broadly recognized. Well, I saw on YouTube videos of performances, from that competition, which was only a few weeks ago, that exhibition competition. I saw Valieva skate for the first time since the Olympics, since she fell, during that final performance, and finished in 4th place, where the event she was expected to win by most commentators, most observers of the sport. She skated the same routines as she had skated during the Olympics, and I thought not quite at the level. And I was thinking, well, maybe we've lost that level in Valieva. Maybe she won't return to that level that she had exhibited before the Olympics, and that had led to her setting world records in these different categories of skating. Well, and it was sad, and I said I've referred to the fact that the brilliance of Nadia Comaneci, the Olympian who scored a 7 perfect 10s in Montreal, was never quite duplicated. These moments of supreme achievement, these moments of divinity, if you like, as the Hindu might experience, are brief, are fragile. Flowers, they can be lost readily. Well, but then there was a final exhibition skating. And in that, Valieva skated again. She skated to a piece of music called Storm that she had skated to in earlier exhibitions elsewhere. This was only like 2 weeks ago, I think. It's online, you can see it. Valieva during this Russian skating, it's called, I forget the name of it, but it was, I think, skated on around April 1st. Well, it's the single greatest skating performance I've ever seen in terms of the level of performance, of balletic achievement, of grace, of perfection of form, of emotional conveyance, the most extraordinary performance I've ever seen. I think greater than anything I've ever seen in Olympic competition, maybe greater than anything in the history of the Olympics, certainly in ice skating, maybe greater than anything in the history of the sport that I've ever seen. And when you go online and read comments, most of them are in Russian. I've been studying Russian, actually, but not to the point where I can yet read those comments. But when you go online, a lot of the comments are recognizing that level, that this is the greatest skater we have ever seen, and this is as great a performance as may be possible. So the point is that reversed for me that whole Olympic narrative. Suddenly, Valieva had triumphed over that failure during the Olympics because she skated better than she had ever skated. She had gone beyond what she would have been able to achieve at the Olympics. She is now better and achieving at a level unimaginable. That is a Hindu embodiment of divinity, right? In the way that Hindus see philosophy, philosophical aphorisms as an embodiment of divinity, as a great river, as acts of great kindness or generosity, as levels of divinity. So, and interestingly, I just found out tonight that there is a video of Valieva skating in costume and in character to a character from the movie, the American film that was done by James Cameron, Avatar. She's skating to the soundtrack of Avatar, a girl who really represents an essential aspect of that concept, not in the fullness of the concept as Krishna embodies, but in the sense that she represents something at the highest level of human achievement. And finally, we think of Christ, we think of as remote figures in time in human history. But it was 2,500 years ago, Christ over 2,000 years ago. Well, Gandhi, the 20th century figure who was responsible for leading India to independence from Britain, who said remarkable things like, my devotion to my people is part of the discipline I impose upon myself to liberate my soul. God cannot appear where there is hate or shame or fear. He said things that represent the deepest understanding of the concept of divinity. Well, I mentioned that Hinduism sees world cycles, the worlds creating, being created, being destroyed endlessly. And within each cosmic cycle, there can be, according to some systems of belief, 10 incarnations of Vishnu, 10 Krishnas, 10 equivalents of Jesus Christ within the Hindu tradition. Well, now, in many sectors, apparently, of Hindu society, Gandhi is seen as the 10th and final incarnation, avatar of Vishnu within the current cosmic cycle. Gandhi. So, not that remote in time to us. Okay, so that, I think, concludes my talk on avatars, bringing them a little bit closer to our present experience of human life and its challenges. Let me address some questions from last time. Once again, I've run longer than I should have. Okay, let me see if I can distill answers to these quickly and satisfy the... Okay, so sorry. Here was Valieva skating, that performance that I thought was remarkable that you can see online. And there she is in the role of Avatar. And there is Gandhi. Okay. First question. In my opinion, the human crisis is a result of not paying attention to humanitarian science, such as philosophy. Yes, I agree. And the point is that it is philosophy that rises to the level of ultimate rigor. And so philosophy is ultimately capable of establishing the reality. It is capable of dispelling our fears and making clear, what we can embrace, what we can, and most importantly, bring us to help silence endless debate and discussion where there is no resolution possible, so that our energies can be directed towards more efficacious ends, things that can benefit us, rather than endless debate over heuristic possibilities that cannot rigorously be resolved. And again, philosophy provides the ultimate perspective, the ultimate understanding of the nature of our condition, and it distinguishes, and I think this is part of the next question. Okay, what is the meaning of the philosophy of the exigencies of health from the modern perspective? Okay, so from a rigorous philosophical perspective, philosophy achieves what Buddhism does, namely what Socrates says at the beginning of the Western tradition, the Western philosophical tradition. So we go our separate ways, you to live and I to die, and which is better, only God knows. We don't even know philosophically if life is superior to death. We don't know for any condition we might be facing, in terms of health and disease, what the better, what the greater outcome is, because we don't know what Remember, the future decides the past is capable of altering any presumptive reality, freeing us from our anxieties. On the other hand, philosophy, by separating the epistemic, which is rigorous, about which there's no debate, from the heuristic, it shows us that the heuristic is our goal-oriented space, and that any goal, including the conquest of a disease, the development of a vaccine, the cure of disease, is achievable as a goal within heuristic space through the characteristics of heuristic space, namely through convergences, through bringing together enough different elements or aspects over enough time to achieve a specific result. But it also shows us that that result can never rigorously be validated in advance. It has to be tested. It has to be experienced. And in any given situation, it can fail because of the epistemics of our circumstance, that every circumstance is rigorously distinct from every other, which is the condition of, again, religious salvation. But what frustrates ultimately our sciences makes science less than rigorous, no matter what its result. And then finally, why is Eden a landscape of philosophical rigor? Okay, I'll give a longer talk on this, I think, but I'm using it metaphorically, Eden as a perfect resolution of our circumstances. And it is that philosophical rigor achieves that because philosophy achieves within epistemic space a complete deconceptualization of experience, so that it achieves what Buddhism achieves through its more belief-based formulation. Nothing lasts. I mean, the real lasts, nothing lasts, therefore nothing is real. That elimination of concepts, which is what that pristine case circumstance of nirvana, which is tantamount to a condition of Eden where suffering cannot arise, does not exist, is what is achievable within the rigor of epistemic space. So that's what I mean by that formulation. Obviously, that's something that could be discussed at much greater length, and I might devote an entire talk to that aphorism on some occasion. Okay, I think that will conclude tonight's exposition.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for the amazing talks today, as always. And we do see all of your likes, your feedback. Thank you. I mean, I'm talking about the audience. I thank you truly. We understand and appreciate it all. And we have an active participant, Jirkan. How are you, Mr. Stephen Friedman? We are very glad to see you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us again.
The same question from Jirkan. How do you think, what kind of philosophical issues or questions actual for scientific researcher, international relationship between the Kazakhstan and the US?
Okay, I will
Okay.
address that next time.
And thank you very much for the helpful lecture. These fundamental lectures will be useful in development Kazakh philosophy.
I would love to think that, and I would love to be contributing to that development. Thank you very much for that comment.
So yeah, one more time, please address all your questions below as well. We will talk and answer them next week. And thank you very much, Stephen, for being with us weekly. Thank you, the audience. We see all the feedback, all the likes and comments. Thank you very much. So stay safe, have a great week, and we will see you all soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Aaliyah, and thank everybody for joining and for asking your questions, which I will answer next time, as always. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. Have a good